So to start off, we're just going to do a few introductions. So my name is Abby Garber. I am the Policy Director for Generation Ratify Virginia. Besides Generation Ratify Virginia, I am involved in my local politics in Rockingham County. I am very passionate about many of the issues we will be discussing today. Generation Ratify Virginia is the Virginia chapter of the youth-led movement to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and fight for gender equality. For those of you who are not familiar with the Equal Rights Amendment, it is the amendment that would guarantee equality on the basis of sex once and for all. Women have been fighting for the ERA since 1923, and we are closer than ever. Our organization also focuses on legislation and campaigns that promote gender equality. We also support organizations that aid in women's rights. Generation Ratify Virginia is very excited to help facilitate this meaningful discussion and learn more about these issues. Now I'm going to pass it over to Shafuq.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Shafuq Naseem, and I'm also one of the moderators for the town hall today. And I am also very passionate about a lot of the issues that we will be discussing today. I am a volunteer and organizer on Zainab's campaign, and when I first heard that she was running, I was automatically like, okay, I need to get involved. This is one of the most important elections that I will ever be a part of, honestly. And so I'm really happy to be a part of her campaign, and I'm really happy to have this conversation with everyone today. So I will pass it back to Abby so we can introduce our guest for today.
Thank you, Shafuq. Zainab Mohsini is a progressive Democrat running for Virginia's 11th congressional district seat in the House of Representatives. Her desire to be more involved in social activism led Zainab to complete 2 terms as an AmeriCorps member at a college equity nonprofit organization. In her role, Zainab supported individuals with similar experiences as her own navigate the economic and social realities of being a low-income student. Additionally, in this position, Zainab led trainings on racial justice, women's rights, and LGBTQ+ issues.
Her campaign recenters politics around working class people. She is fighting for a future where we can support immigrants, make education more accessible, and advance racial justice so that everyone can succeed. Her platform consists of pushing for Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, racial, reproductive, and immigrant justice, and more that we can hope to, and so many more issues that we hope to learn about in today's town hall. And so now I will hand it over to Zainab Mohsini to further introduce herself more in depth, and we can transition into then asking her some questions.
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, awesome. Well, like everybody said, my name is Zainab Mohsini, and first of all, thank you for Generation Ratify for putting this together. Thank you, Shafuq, for working with Gen Ratify. Thank you for everybody else for being here. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to talk about women's rights. So, Zainab Mohsini, I'm a congressional candidate in Congressional District 11. I'm running as a progressive Democrat, and y'all just kind of gave an overview of what my campaign's about. So just to go directly into today's topic, women's rights is who I am. My identity as a woman is inseparable from my identity as a person of color, and as a brown person, as a working class person. So this discussion is really important to me because my first introduction of advocating for myself and standing up to people in power, in positions of power, is related to my identity as a woman. So throughout my life, it's been a struggle for me to get others to take me seriously, to hire me, to trust me because of the stereotypes that they have in their minds about brown refugee women like me. So even as a candidate, I continuously get distressing disturbing messages from men. Men always reach out to explain things to me that I already know, and that even organizations whose purpose and whose kind of mission is to uplift women, which are mostly run by white women, such as Network Nova, and now don't support me. I have reached out. I have try to make these connections, and it just hasn't happened. And I think that, and then this issue is like exacerbated for people, for especially women who have marginalized identities, such as brown women, Black women, LGBTQIA plus women, and low-income women who are generally left out of conversations and about women's rights. We can see that in our society specifically now that where Black women are the leaders of in the front lines of social justice movements and movements against like police brutality, but people in positions of power discount the perspectives and pain of Black women all the time. And I think that that's why also there are higher maternal mortality rates for Black women. Black women are less likely to be believed in cases of sexual assault, and Black women face all other kinds of societal barriers. That's why we're here today, and to discuss women's rights movement, how women's rights movement can be inclusive of experiences of women who are on the front lines of societal oppression.
Great, thank you so much, Zainab. And Abby, if you would like to explain a little bit more about the recent events that have been occurring in Black communities and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, so we're going to transition into a time of discussion about the Black Lives Matter movement. As I am sure many of you are aware of, police brutality, but more specifically racism, is an issue that has been plaguing our country since its beginning. With the recent addition of social media, many instances of police brutality are being broadcast for all of the public to see. The recent murder of George Floyd by 4 Minneapolis police officers has sparked many uprisings across the country. George Floyd is just one name of the thousands that have been murdered by the police because of the color of their skin. Police brutality directly impacts women as well. Breonna Taylor, a young EMT in Louisville, Kentucky, was murdered by 3 non-uniformed police officers who broke into the wrong home in the middle of the night. This senseless crime occurred in mid-March, and the officers have not yet been charged. The uprisings are in protest of the racism our country was built on, and the thousands of Black people who have been killed due to systematic racism. We must fight for justice for all of the lives taken too soon. We are here today to focus on women's rights, but more specifically, women's rights in communities of color. This is because women of color and non-binary people of color are too often underserved by legislation and policy and holding these conversations.
Yes, and though we are going to be discussing issues that impact women who hold many different identities, we really want to acknowledge that we don't represent nor can we speak for all women. For example, there are no Black women or transgender women today on this panel. At the same time, we want to openly talk about the many inequities they face and that women as a group have faced in America, and continue to push ourselves to have these necessary conversations with ourselves and with others so that we can continue to stand in solidarity with Black communities, transgender communities, and all communities of women. And so with that being said, we are going to transition into asking Zainab some questions today about her platform, different policies she supports, and a lot of these issues are surrounding women of color and that directly impact them. And so our first question for today is, how will your policies affect the Native women in Virginia? How do you plan to address the epidemic of violence against women here in Virginia?
Thank you, Shafuq. Before we move on to the questions, I just wanted to highlight that we're also, as far as I know, we don't have any women who are here today that have visible disabilities. So just another thing for us to acknowledge. And thank you for the question. I think that in terms of when we're talking about Indigenous women have been at the forefront of state and sexual violence for generations. Indigenous women have been forcibly sterilized by doctors. There are no, there's a lack and poor healthcare access and abortion access to Indigenous women, and they face high levels of sexual violence, much of it from other races, much of it from men of other races, particularly white men. The Indian Health Service doesn't have enough funding or resources to cover Indigenous women, and we need to implement and advocate for Medicare for all in order to provide equal access to everyone. And then there are usually not enough quality healthcare centers and quality healthcare providers for Indigenous women, and many of whom do live on reservations in rural areas. So I think that we need to support developing and building high quality hospitals in rural areas and on reservations, that everyone can have access to healthcare. In terms of the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women, we need to allow reservations to be able to prosecute people who aren't affiliated with the tribe, who come onto the Indigenous lands and to commit violence. As it stands, many tribes are unable to fully prosecute non-Indigenous men who commit crimes against women on the reservations, and Indigenous women also face violence from the police. We need to work towards defunding the police, and we need to increase social services programs so that Indigenous women can receive more support in cases of sexual assault, domestic violence, and other types of abuse that they face.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. Our second question is, how will these policies affect women of color in the workplace when it comes to treatment between other employers and managers?
So one of my policy platforms is to enact a 21st Century Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act that reinstates parts of the act that were the existing acts that have been removed by the Supreme Court in recent years. This act will provide more protection from discrimination in the areas of employment, housing, technology, data and healthcare and wages. This act will also provide more resources to support people who have employment, workplace, and wage discrimination. So we need to change the culture of workplace so that everyone has an environment where they can thrive. We need to invest in our educational system so that people learn about history of racial violence in our country, learn about social justice, learn about how to be anti-racist in our society. And that means that we also need more women leaders, women teachers, and teachers of color. We need to create more federal pathways to support these groups to have positions of power.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And actually, our next question relates to our first question about Native American women who have faced abuse and who don't necessarily feel comfortable calling the police. And so our next question is, many women of color don't feel comfortable calling the police on the domestic abuser, and what legislation can we pass and uplift to protect women of color who are victims of domestic violence?
Mm-hmm. I think, as many of us know, that many communities, particularly communities of color, immigrant communities, don't feel comfortable calling the police because of the deep histories and the present of realities of police brutality and misconduct within those communities. We need to work towards defunding the police and investing more in social services, like I said before. We need better programs that support survivors of domestic violence. We need more federal resources going towards providing safe houses, counseling support, support groups, transitional housing programs, job resources, and childcare for victims of domestic violence.
So next, we will be going into the topic of healthcare. Women of color face disparities when it comes to receiving equitable and quality healthcare. For example, research has shown that implicit racial bias may cause doctors to spend less time with Black patients, and that Black people receive less effective care. Providers are also more likely to underestimate the pain of their Black patients, ignore their symptoms, or dismiss their complaints. How will your healthcare platform ensure that these disparities become non-existent?
So the policy of Medicare for All that I support has specific racial justice clauses that call for medical providers, professionals to receive implicit bias and anti-racism training, because we know that there's data to prove that that those disparities exist. We also need to close the gaps in access to healthcare. We need to open more hospitals in communities of color, lower income communities, and rural and minority communities. I think that Medicare for All should also help gaps in accessing quality healthcare. So we should also have medical groups who report their outcomes by race and gender, and then create strategies to close those gaps.
Definitely. And you mentioned that often for women who are low income, they often also face barriers when receiving quality health care. And so people living in poverty, particularly people of color and low income individuals, face the largest barriers to accessing reproductive care in general. And in Virginia, Medicaid only covers abortion procedures in extreme cases, which means that every year thousands of low-income people are left on their own to come up with hundreds of dollars in order to access reproductive care. So how would you say that your stance on reproductive justice intertwines with your platform that strongly advocates for Medicare for all?
So like I said, I support a Medicare for All program that repeals the Hyde Amendment. In order to fully cover abortion procedures, abortion laws tend to be worse in the south of the US, where majority of Black population lives. The huge burdens that are put on people who are trying to get abortion access disproportionately affects Black people, just like the rest of our healthcare system. I support getting rid of trap laws. So trap laws are targeted regulations of abortion providers that often put huge burdens on clinics without improving anything in patient care. So sometimes they'll be about how small your hall is or how big your waiting room is, just to create barriers for independent abortion providers, who tend to be the biggest providers of abortion care in the US. I support getting rid of all mandatory waiting periods for abortion procedures. So some states have just to create barriers, would force patients to go in for a couple visits before they're able to get their procedure. Crisis pregnancy centers are these religious organizations that pose as a healthcare center and and they tend to set base in communities of color, lower income communities, to convince people to not get abortions. I support making crisis pregnancy centers make patient disclosures if they aren't medical professionals or aren't providing scientifically accurate medical advice. So there's a trap law case that is in front of the Supreme Court for this year. It's called June Medical Services versus Russo. And all of the House Democrats sent an amicus brief to the Supreme Court to protect Roe versus Wade, and the incumbent failed to sign that. And I think that we need to have policies that protect women's right to abortion care and protect reproductive care all the time, not when it's politically convenient. So I will advocate for all of the policy changes required.
Thank you for that. That was incredible. Transgender people face numerous health disparities as well as stigmas, discrimination, and lack of access to quality care. It's crucial that we talk and educate about these disparities and advocate for policies that will diminish them. Can you elaborate more on this? And how will you advocate for healthcare that is accessible for transgender women? Can you touch on how healthcare for cisgender women differs from transgender women?
Yeah, so like I said, in my support and advocacy of Medicare for All, one clause of it would be to include transitional services for non-binary and transgender people. I also want Medicare for All to cover PrEP, to be beneficial to the greater LGBTQIA+ community. I want trans and non-binary youth are particularly trans and non-binary youth of color are overrepresented in the homeless population. I see housing as a human right, and I think that we need to make more federal investments into transitional housings and affordable housing to make housing an option for people who are displaced because of family discrimination that exists within their families, to be able to have access to those. Some of these investments will come from the Green New Deal. I support the Green New Deal of public housing, which will renovate existing public housing to make it more sustainable and healthier. It will also repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment so that we can create more public housing options. So the Fair Cloth Amendment is an amendment that caps the number of public housing units that we can build. So I also support an equality right similar to the one that was passed in Virginia, to on a federal level that will outlaw discrimination against the LGBTQIA plus people, and will have the LGBTQIA plus community will have federal protection against discrimination.
Great, yeah, so now we are going to talk about education. And so our first question is, how will you advocate for making college education more accessible for women of color, as well as reforming our K through 12 education system and making that as strong as possible so that those who are going through the K through 12 system are ready to go off to college and have the resources that they need to succeed?
Yeah, so I think that this is a cause that's like incredibly important to myself because I was a low-income student, college student. So what happens is under our current system, schools in communities of color and low-income communities tend to be underfunded because our school funding is attached to our property taxes. So they tend to create a barrier for lower income communities and communities of color. So because of redlining and institutionalized poverty, many of these communities have lower property values. And so on average, and compared to like a middle class, upper or middle class areas in Fairfax. So we need to provide like more federal funding to fill the gaps in funding so that our communities of color and low-income communities have access to quality education. Currently, only 8% of federal budget is only 8% is provided for public education. So I think we need to increase that to make our education system be more equitable. I think part of my plan is also because I support free public colleges and universities for people who want to pursue higher education. And I also want there to be a free universal pre-K, which also will be part of the to create more accessibility for women and for parents who can't afford childcare, so they can't go back into the workforce. I think that when we have free universal pre-Ks, it sets everybody, starts everybody out at a equitable educational career. So I think that those are some of the policies that I support that will be beneficial to communities of color and lower income communities.
Thank you. Now we will transition into discussing employment. According to a 2015 study, transgender people face an unemployment rate 3 times as high as the national average. A similar study shows that 1 in 10 LGBTQ plus people reported removing items from their resume to hide sexual orientation or gender identity from their employers. Can you elaborate on policies you support or will introduce to hold employers accountable for workplace discrimination?
Yes, so I mentioned this before. I will advocate for an Equality Act that will provide federal level protection against discrimination in employment. The act will call for increased hiring transparency so that we can have more programs for people to report discrimination. We will also need a national jobs guarantee to help people who are having difficulties finding employment, which will be a equitable employment. Like it will provide equitable employment opportunities for everybody, including the transgender community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to go along with that, equal pay and the gender wage gap is a major issue for women of color. And in Virginia, we have 284,040 Black women working full-time and year-round. They are only paid $38,566 compared to the white man's $65,294 median annual salary. And so if the wage gap were eliminated, a Black woman would be able to pay for 156 weeks of groceries for her family. What is your plan to work with employers to close the pay and opportunity gap for women, in particular women of color, LGBTQ plus women, and working mothers?
So as many of us know, that the pay gap disproportionately affects women of color. So according to the National Partnership for Women and Families, Black women are paid 62 cents to every dollar a white man makes. Indigenous women are 57 cents to every dollar, and Latina women are 54 cents to every dollar that a white man makes. So we need to create a pay transparency so that companies publish their pay grade levels and keep it consistent among gender and race. We need to support paid parental leave, which we don't have at the federal level. And then creating a universal free pre-K so that women can have support in raising their children without losing their jobs or taking unpaid time off work.
Thank you. Now we are going to discuss the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, which I elaborated on earlier. So in a recent poll, 94% of Americans stated that they support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that guarantees equal rights on the basis of sex. How will you support adding the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution?
Once in Congress, I will advocate for Congress to expand the deadline for ratification of the ERA and that it becomes part of the U.S. Constitution. I think that's just, and like as a woman, and I think as somebody who believes in equity and justice, I think that would be 100% something that I would fight for.
And so, going back to violence against women, and you might have elaborated on this earlier, however, over 18% of Black women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. 53% of Black transgender women, have been sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. However, this number only accounts for the number of individuals who have reported their abuse. How will you protect every woman from sexual violence, whether that may be in the workplace, on college campuses, and overall?
So we need to change the framework of how we discuss sexual assaults in our public sphere. The societal and cultural change can start in the classroom. In health classrooms, we need to discuss consent and importance of consent in sexual activities. Part of the program is that our society's gender roles for men often follow for men to disregard the desire of women. So to discount the perspective of women, to discount the comfort of women. So there's also little, if any, education about consent in the LGBTQIA relationships or LGBTQIA sexual health. We need a more rigorous sexual health and discourse in our educational and public sphere that emphasizes consent, healthy relationships, and prevents power-based violence. We also need better laws to protect survivors of sexual assault and sexual violence. As it stands, many women, particularly women of color and LGBTQIA plus women, don't feel comfortable calling the police because of historical trauma and present realities related to police brutality. We need to defund our policing system and shift to our social services model that focuses on providing resources for survivors and creating avenues for restorative justice. That means that we also need to keep our elected leaders accountable. if elected leaders commit or are suspected in acts of sexual violence and abuse, we need to create a standard for how the case will be investigated, and restorative justice will be pursued. As it stands, many men in positions of power are shielded or can't shield themselves from accountability through non-disclosure agreements, through settle out of court settlements. We need to have a better system of accountability and restorative justice that prioritizes survivors of sexual assault.
Thank you for your insights on that topic. Our next question is, what are your positions on the VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act?
So I support the Violence Against Women Act and think that it's an important way that many immigrants find safety and resources after they experience violence.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going beyond that, on elaborating more on that question, I know the Violence Against Women Act provides a lot of legal aid to those who are low income. And do you think that there are any maybe elaborations on this act that you would like to see made? If you see any, if not, and that's okay too. I was just curious.
Okay, so as I said before, that many women, like particularly immigrants and women of color, don't feel comfortable seeking the help of the police when it comes to violence, and so we need to work towards defunding the police and investing in social programs. Like I said before, we need programs to support survivors of domestic abuse. We need more for federal resources going towards safe houses, counseling, support groups, and transitional programs. I think that adding job resources to the services, adding childcare for victims can alleviate those voices and serve as support for the victims.
Absolutely. And so you brought this up earlier a few times. Women of color oftentimes don't feel comfortable calling the police, and so that is an accurate transition into our next topic, which is discussing women of color in the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And so, according to a 2003 Bureau of Justice Statistics special report, 1 in every 18 African American women will go to prison during their lifetime if incarceration rates continue at the same rate. This is far greater than the rates for white women and Latinas, 1 in 111 women and 1 in 45 women, respectively. How will you work to reform the criminal justice system so this disparity does not continue?
So I support to end the prison industrial complex. I think there must be a complete overhaul of our criminal justice system, which I think that is wrongly named because a lot of people go through the justice system, but which is so discriminatory, that can be accomplished through ending cash bail, focusing on rehabilitative programs while decriminalizing most drug offenses, and retroactively reducing or ending drug-related sentences. We need to create incentives for lawyers to be public defenders, because as we know, there's a shortage of public defenders in our system. We need to create a strict federal anti-discrimination regulations in regard to sentencing and plea deals. A lot of people are forced into plea deals. So we need to shift from a punitive focus of our prison industrial complex to restorative justice. Somebody asked me the other day what restorative justice means. Is basically when you work with people and give them the support that they need instead of punishing them. So we need to shut down private prisons. It's a profiteering business. A lot of people make money so that nobody's able to profit from detaining people. We need to end forced labor in prisons, and I think that this was more evident when COVID hit, that a lot of prison labor was used to create hand sanitizers and for a penny a day or something like that, something very very minimal, if at all. We need to get rid of questions related to criminal history. People who go through the criminal justice system are discriminated against in the job market they've served their time, and ending the process of denying civil and human rights to prisoners. So a lot of people who go through that criminal justice system, there aren't a lot of support for them when they come out. So I will fight for the substantial changes in our prison industrial complex and elevate activists, people who've been on the ground and been doing this work for generations, and have them be a part of the creation of policies and have their voices be at the forefront of how to fix our criminal justice system.
Thank you. Our next question is, what or how can people do to help pass legislation that they support?
Elect me. So I think that all jokes aside, I think that electing progressive people, electing people like me who advocate for progressive policies. I come from a community organizer background, and want community members to be at the table where decisions are made about our lives. And there are communities, there are community organizers who fight for progressive legislation, for progressive change on the ground. We need leadership that focuses from the bottom up. The incumbent has not been a leader on women's rights at all. And I think that people need to organize on the ground as well. I think that we see this, especially now when it comes to systematic racism, that these protests that have been happening have brought in such positive results. So there needs to be public pressure on our elected official that protests are very effective, calling your representative, taking public actions, and electing truly leftist candidates. I think that the word progressive has become this common word that a lot of people are using, but I think that there are certain values that go with people calling themselves progressive, but people who are nowadays calling themselves progressive don't advocate for those values. So I think that having strong progressive true leftists be in the decision-making tables is like some of the ways that we can create positive change.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. So our last question before we open up to any audience questions at the moment is, what advice would you give to women wanting to pursue politics as a career?
This is like a really good question. I think that it's the unfortunate reality that you will face sexual harassment. I think people will constantly question your capability as a leader. It's even more difficult when you're a woman of color, when you're a low-income woman, a disabled queer woman, and specifically those people who aren't already part of the conversation and don't exist in circles of power. So much of the traditional ways of running for office is to develop relationships with the party establishment, with elected officials, and to ask high dollar donors for money. If you're like me, I became the first person in my family to graduate college, grew up in poverty, and as a working class person, and a brown Muslim woman, which we don't typically exist in those spaces. People in positions of power and the general public will constantly ask you to prove that your voice deserves to be heard, and that you deserve to be in a decision-making, change-making position. And I think that some of the hardest parts of come from where other women and other organizations who are supposed to be who are designed to uplift, refuse to support you. It's hurtful. And then as a woman of color, I know that much of the rejections that I've received come from spaces that are dominated by white women. So my experience of what it means to be a woman, the changes that I want to make and are different than theirs, and they tend to reject me because I don't fit their image of what a woman candidate should be. So I would recommend surrounding yourself with staff and volunteers, and Shafuq, you can attest to this, who are going to fit an uphill battle and encourage you not to change yourself in order to be more acceptable to those in positions of power. I think that my goal has always been to challenge the status quo, because I see the inequities in the other side of what the status quo does to people and their livelihood. So in order to get power, which has always been denied to people like us, we need to build strong movements in our communities. We need to focus on grassroots aspects of meeting with the community members and bringing attention to their issues. And that's how we build power to make change.
Absolutely. And yeah, so we would also love to open up questions to the audience. If you have any, please leave them in the chat, and yeah, we can have some questions there. So add those questions to the chat. If you're able to. I think we have the chat open to everyone, but.
So Hannah Nittig asked, when is the election?
So the primary is on June 23rd. So part of the, we're trying to have people be cautious of COVID-19, so to protect public health while being able to recognize uphold your right to vote. We're encouraging people to request your absentee ballot. The deadline is on June 16th. So please request your absentee ballot and send it in if you feel comfortable going out on the day. Polling stations will be open. There are many primaries going on. So please do what you feel is the best, but election is June 23rd.
An anonymous attendee asked, if you had one issue you could magically solve, which would it be?
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. So anonymous attendee, that's a great question. I think that it's tough because I think there's so much intersection between systems of oppression. I think that my political education happened in a racial justice environment. So a lot of what I understand of the US politics and how I got involved was because I started surrounding myself with people who are very racial justice focused. So I think racism would be one, but I think that there's so much interconnection that we cannot take one system of oppression down without acknowledging and trying to take all of them down.
Abby Dotson asked, for those of us who aren't of age to vote, how can we support you and other candidates in the future, as well as influence others to vote?
That's a great question. I think that for people who cannot vote, I think a grassroots campaigns need volunteers. We need fundraising. So a lot of the movement that has been happening around grassroots, a lot of working class people are running grassroots campaigns. So we don't take corporate PAC money. We don't take oil money. So fundraising is a huge issue for us. And until we get rid of money in politics, I think that you can volunteer. I think that education is really important around voting. I think recognizing that every aspect of our lives are impacted by the policies that are being made, be it at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. So I think that having those conversations, normalizing political talk, I think we live in a society where a lot of people we don't talk about politics, and I think it's something that's really important, and it's also something that's really helpful because, hopeful is what I meant to say. It's very hopeful to see younger people who are interested, who want to make change, and who are recognizing the flaws in our system and want to live in a more just and equitable society.
So we will move on to another question from Diana. Who have been your greatest teachers on your journey to activism and running for office?
I think that because I come from a organizing background, a lot of my peers who taught me so much about social justice, who taught me so much about racial justice, I think when we look at political figures, I think Shirley Chisholm, somebody who was one of the first people to run for president, one of the first Black woman to run for president, I think when the entire world was against her. Somebody like Bernie Sanders, I think somebody who fights for justice and equality and wants to fight for somebody they don't know. Somebody like Kitty Porter, somebody who's from California, who is amazing, AOC, the squad. I think people who break barriers, who go in with a moral compass and fight for the things that are important to them.
Our next question comes from Mia Schenkman. How do you plan to overcome or deal with the current polarized political environment where many politicians are refusing to listen to each other?
I think that it's important for people from the community to be a part of political decision making, right? I think that so many issues that impact people's lives become a political discussion when it's not. I think racial justice is not a political discussion. It's a civil rights, it's a human rights issue. So I think that electing people who have lived experiences, who are there because they want to make change, and holding your elected officials accountable. I think so much of politics is about theatrics, right? People put on big performances, but research your representatives, research your elected officials to see what their voting history says, what legislations they have spearheaded, what kind of advocacy that they're doing within their elected official position to better people's lives. So I think that that's the beauty of living in a democracy, that we, the people, choose what issues are important with our vote, with our volunteerism, with who we elect.
Awesome. And so we have another question from Ellie. Living in a very conservative, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, racist, xenophobic community, it's difficult to not fit that stereotype. How can we best stand up for our equal rights and our beliefs?
So I think that's a tough question, because I think, like you said, there are a lot of boxes that the society wants to put people in, and if you don't fit some of those boxes or some of those identities, you're marginalized. I think that we can, the beauty of people who face discrimination, who face marginalization, is that we're resilient. And I think that fighting for what you believe is the right thing, I think that whether people agree with you or not, that you're doing the right thing, you're standing up for the right, for the moral beliefs that you hold. There's no question that it's hard, and that it's an uphill battle, but please believe in the power that you're doing the right thing.
Our next question comes from Aliyah Khan. Where does Zainab stand on affordable housing, specifically when it comes to single mothers of low income or who are unemployed?
So I think we touched on this a little bit earlier about how I support the bill that's in the public housing bill that's in Congress regarding as a part of the Green New Deal. So making that affordable and getting rid of the Fair Cloth Amendment to allow us to create more public housing, to be able to have people who are lower income, who are single parents, to be able to afford those housing units.
And we have another question from Hannah Nittig. How can we stay in touch with Zainab's campaign? So
Okay, so I have a website at zainabmohsini.com, and I could put it in the chat as well. And Shafuq, if you want to put it in the chat, that'd be awesome. I'm on Twitter at Zainab Mohsini. I have Facebook and Instagram, Zainab for Congress. You can also email us, reach out through the website. I make it a point that my campaign manager and I are the people who check those emails and respond to everyone accordingly.
So I think this may be our last question. Thank you guys so much for all of these incredible questions. So our final question comes from one of our incredible attendees. What would you say is your biggest strength as a candidate?
My biggest strength as a candidate, I think that I have a lot of lived experiences. I truly believe in the sentiment that I want to fight for people, for someone who I don't know. So I think that there is a lack of empathy, a lack of concern for people, for people's lives, and the policy decisions that are made, and how we can make that to be human rights centered. I think that my lived experiences informs all of that. So that's what I would say is my biggest strength as a candidate.
Thank you so much, Zainab. And before we close our town hall for today, I want to emphasize that, we all need to stand up for the Black community, especially right now, and we need to continue to stand up for them. And so there are a lot of resources that I believe would be helpful, such as signing petitions, donating, protesting. If you aren't able to protest, as I said, sign petitions. There are ways to educate yourself on the systemic racism that has plagued our country for centuries. And, I'm not going to pretend that I know all of the solutions and all of the answers, but those are some resources that hopefully, if you haven't already taken advantage of, those will help you get started. And so that's, if Zainab, if you'd like to add anything else to that, how our amazing advocates can take action, especially right now, that would be great.
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, that I think that we need to stand in solidarity with our Black siblings. Whatever you have the capacity to, if you could donate $1, $2, if you can go out to protest, if you can sign petitions, if you can amplify their voices on social media, I think that there's something that we all can do. There are so many resources. I think that people are posting how to support Black-owned businesses. So something as small as sharing on social media, to as big as donating a lot of money or going to protests, it is needed. So I think that our solidarity matters, and we stand by them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we end, we have one final question from Laurel Bosma.
Okay.
Since Congressional District 11 is a highly centrist area in which many people will assume Jerry Connolly is a great candidate without investigating, what do we say to those people to get them to open their minds to voting for Zainab instead?
So I think that there are, like Laurel said, it's a affluent area, and I think a lot of people aren't aware that the issues that we see, that I see as a candidate. One of them is, as a refugee, my life has been impacted by war. So I'm an anti-war candidate, whereas Jerry Connolly has $400,000 of his personal money invested in the military-industrial complex. He sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so he gets to make those decisions of about war, but then also profits from it. So I think that closing the revolving door of this political profiteering of politicians sitting on committees that they are creating legislation that they could profit from. Something like Jerry Connolly doesn't support Medicare for all. He doesn't support free public colleges and universities, which impact the daily lives of so many people within the district. The campaign takes his campaign takes money from ICE contractors, and I think that it enables caging of children. So it's uplifting these systems that exist that discriminate against people, immigrant communities, especially in a district that's over 30% immigrants. Those are just some of the highlights. He supported the war in Syria, but then also voted on a Republican bill to make it harder for Syrian and Iraqi refugees to enter the US. The list goes on. He used the HEROES Act as recently as during COVID to advocate for the defense contracting industry executives to make billions of dollars. So these are stances that he has taken that doesn't support many communities. And I think that, as we know, police brutality is huge, and he voted against a bill that would demilitarize the police 2 months before Ferguson. So those are some of the highlights.
Great. So I don't believe we have any more questions. So thank you so much, Generation Ratify. Thank you so much, Zainab, for being here today. But if you have any questions and would like to get involved with our campaign, we have the contact information all in the chat. And yeah, so thank you so much for everyone who came today to listen and join our town hall. And yeah, if Abby, if you have anything to add before we close, anything?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This has been such an educational time. Thank you so much to Zainab for, educating me on stuff that I had no idea about. This has been such an important time for us to come together and learn more. And I am so excited for this race. This is going to be awesome. Thank you so much for including Generation Ratify Virginia in this. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. I'm so honored. So yeah, thank you guys so much for attending.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Gen Ratify. Thank you, Shafuq.
Thank you.